I had taken the cabin in Northumberland because I wanted to get away from the noise of the city and the worn-out routines that were starting to eat at my mind. It was early October of 2017, the air already cold enough to make my fingers stiff every morning. I was 31, tired, and looking for quiet. The cabin belonged to a retired farmer who rented it only to a few people each year. It was small, with thick stone walls, a crooked roof, and windows that rattled when the wind pushed against them. It sat at the edge of a large patch of woodland that stretched out behind it for miles. I liked the area because it was empty. There were no neighbors in sight, and the closest village was over a 20-minute walk down a narrow single-lane road. During the first day, I unpacked, swept the wooden floor, and stacked the canned food I brought with me. The air smelled like damp wood and old ash trapped inside the fireplace. I didn't mind. I wanted the silence. I wanted the sense of being removed from everything. On the second night, the weather turned. A soft drizzle tapped on the roof in a slow rhythm. I sat inside with a blanket around my shoulders, reading by the weak yellow light of a small lamp. I kept glancing toward the windows because I wasn't used to such darkness. In the city, even night had a glow to it. Here, everything beyond the glass looked like ink with shapes hidden inside it. I slept badly that night because I kept waking up to different small noises, mostly branches brushing the cabin walls or the metal gutter tapping as it cooled. I thought it was normal in a place this old. The third evening, something felt different the moment the sun went down. The air felt heavier, and I couldn't shake off a strange sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, sitting on the small couch with my socks pulled high, drinking lukewarm tea and focusing on the sound of the wind. My mind kept drifting toward the window again and again, as if something outside was waiting for me to notice it. Halfway through the night, I got up to boil water. I stepped toward the window to close the curtain. The field outside was dim, lit only by the weak moon behind drifting clouds. At first I saw nothing, just the dark outline of the trees and the uneven land. But when my eyes adjusted, I noticed a shape much closer than it should have been. A woman stood near the small fence about 20 meters from the cabin. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking. She was just standing there facing the cabin. I froze so quickly that my legs felt like they didn't belong to me. I kept my eyes locked on her because I didn't know what else to do. She looked thin, almost too thin to be healthy. Her clothes were dark, maybe black or deep gray. I couldn't tell in the moonlight. Her hair looked messy and long, reaching her shoulders, but the wind didn't seem to move it. I pulled the curtain shut slowly, afraid that any quick movement might make her come closer. My heart thumped so hard it felt like it was shaking inside my ribs. I stood there for a long time, breathing through my mouth because it felt like the air had turned sharp around me. I hoped she was just a hiker or someone from a nearby property, but the area was too isolated for someone to stand outside a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night. After about an hour, I gathered the courage to peek again. When I pulled the curtain just enough to see out, she was gone. The fence and field were empty, only the dark stretching out toward the trees. I went to bed but barely slept. The next morning, I walked outside to check the area. The ground was wet from the night rain, soft and easy to mark. I searched around the fence and found faint footprints, like someone had been standing still for a long time. The tracks led toward the tree line, disappearing into the mud and pine needles. I stepped back, my breath fogging in front of me, and tried convincing myself it wasn't as strange as it felt. Maybe she had been lost. Maybe she had been looking for help. But there had been no knock on my door, no movement at all, just standing. That detail kept sitting in my chest like a heavy stone. The day passed slowly, the air cold and quiet. I didn't go for my usual walk because I didn't want to wander too far from the cabin. Every sound in the woods made me jump. Birds, shifting branches, even my own boots stepping on gravel. By the time the sky turned orange in the late afternoon, I felt even worse than the night before. The dread settled into my stomach like something thick and cold. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see her standing there again. When night came, I locked the door, pushed a chair against it even though the lock was strong, and sat with every lamp in the cabin turned on. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, rattling the loose edge of the gutter. The lights made the inside feel safer, but at the same time the brightness made every shadow outside look deeper. Around midnight, I heard a slow crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. My chest tightened so fast it hurt. I stayed still, gripping the arms of the chair so hard my fingers numbed. The footsteps moved across the front of the cabin. Slow, steady, careful. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps stopped just under the living room window. I knew she was there. I didn't need to look. The idea of her face pressed close to the glass made my eyes water. After several minutes, the steps continued around the side of the cabin, soft and dragging at times, then disappearing into the woods behind the building. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally arrived, I walked outside again, more scared of the daytime silence than the night. I followed the prints at the side of the cabin, and again they led toward the woods. This time they seemed heavier, deeper in the mud, as if she had been standing still again. That afternoon, I made the choice to leave. I could not spend another night there. My hands shook the entire time I packed. Even small sounds inside the cabin made my nerves jump. I kept thinking she was watching from the trees, waiting for the sun to disappear again. When the sky dimmed, I loaded my backpack and walked toward the road. The village was far, but I didn't want to wait for the local bus that only came twice a day. I wanted to move. I had walked only a few minutes when I turned around for one last look at the cabin. Something stood near the back corner of the building. A dark shape, thin and still. The same height, the same outline. She was watching me leave. I didn't turn back again. I walked faster, almost running even though the road twisted and dipped into small valleys. My eyes kept watering from the cold air, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to give her the chance to catch up or to follow. By the time I reached the village, the sky was almost black. I went into the small public house and stayed there until morning, barely able to steady my breathing. I told no one what happened because I didn't even know what to say. There was no crime, no attack, no explanation. Just a woman watching a stranger's cabin 2 nights in a row. I took the earliest bus out of the area and never returned. A week later, I learned from the cabin's owner that a woman had been reported missing several months earlier in the same woods. No one had found her. No one knew if she had left the area or if she had stayed hidden somewhere in those thick trees. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't want to imagine the truth behind it. What stayed with me most wasn't the fear of her standing there. It was the way she moved slowly around the cabin, knowing I was inside, knowing I could see her if I looked out. Felt planned. Felt like she wanted me to know she was there. I still think about that cabin, the heavy silence of the woods, and the thin shape near the fence on that cold night. I still see her standing there in my memory exactly the same way, still quiet, watching. And the clearest ending to it all is this. I know she wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. She wasn't looking for help. She had been waiting there long before I arrived, and she would still be there long after I left. I drove into northern Idaho in late October of 1996, a time when the air felt thin and every breath tasted cold. I had taken a week off work after months of stress that had worn me down until even the sound of traffic irritated me. I picked this area because it was quiet and cheap, and because a coworker had mentioned an old cabin near a lake that could be rented for almost nothing. I didn't think much about why it cost so little. All I wanted was space and silence. The last town before the forest was small and almost empty. I stopped for gas, and while the pump clicked away, I looked out at the long road that led into the trees. The forest looked endless, thick with tall pines and heavy shadows that swallowed light even in the afternoon. I remember thinking the place looked older than the country around it, like a place that didn't care about people at all. Still, I drove on, following a dirt road that got narrower and rougher the deeper it went. I reached the cabin in late afternoon. It sat on a small rise above a dried field, with the lake hidden farther back behind another line of trees. The cabin itself was small, only one floor with a small porch and a tin roof that had rust along the edges. The wooden boards were faded gray, and some areas looked like they had been replaced at different times by different hands. It wasn't pretty, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and no neighbors. That was all I wanted. Inside, the place smelled like old dust and cold air. There was a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, a narrow bed, and a single table by the window. The window looked out at the field and the dirt road. From there, everything seemed calm, just wind blowing through grass that had already turned yellow with the season. I unpacked, made a simple meal, and settled into the silence. The first night passed quietly except for the wind. It rattled the loose metal on the roof and hissed around the corners of the cabin, but nothing unusual happened. I slept hard and long. The next day, I walked to the lake. The water was dark and still, surrounded by tall pines that rose like pillars. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the small sounds of leaves falling from branches and the distant groan of trees leaning with the wind. Something about the place made time feel slower. It wasn't until the 3rd day that I noticed something odd. I found footprints on the dirt behind the cabin. They weren't mine. They were from heavier boots, and they circled the cabin once before disappearing into the trees. First, I tried to explain it away. A hunter, maybe, someone passing through. The forest belonged to everyone. Still, the prints were close, too close. Someone had walked right up to the cabin and looked around. I tried to ignore the feeling of unease growing in my stomach. I spent the day hiking farther into the forest, but even then, I felt watched. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. The forest around me stayed quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had felt before. It was a heavy quiet, like something waiting. When I returned to the cabin near sunset, I checked for new footprints but didn't see any. Still, I felt like the air had changed inside the cabin. I couldn't explain why. It just felt wrong. That night, I slept lightly. Every sound woke me. The crack of branches, the soft scrape of something against wood, the shifting wind. Sometime after midnight, I heard a dull thud from the direction of the porch. Not loud, but heavy enough to make my heart pound. I stayed still in bed, holding my breath, listening for more. Nothing followed for a long time. Eventually, I fell asleep again out of exhaustion. The next morning, I found the porch step cracked slightly, like something heavy had stepped on it. I looked around the dirt again and saw faint prints heading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. They looked fresh. My thoughts raced in circles as I tried to find a simple explanation, but nothing felt right. I should have packed up and left then, but I told myself I was just on edge because I wasn't used to the quiet or the isolation. I'd never stayed alone this deep in the woods before. I convinced myself I was imagining danger where there was none. That day, the wind picked up and clouds rolled in from the west. By late afternoon, the sky turned dark and a cold, steady rain began to fall. I stayed inside, made a fire in the stove, and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. The rain blurred the view, turning the world outside into gray shapes that moved with every gust of wind. Near dusk, I saw something in the field through the rain. A figure, tall, still, facing the cabin. It stood far enough away that I couldn't see details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't an accident. It wasn't someone just passing through. This person was watching. My body froze with a kind of fear I had never felt before. I waited for the figure to move, but it stayed there, motionless. I couldn't even tell if it was breathing. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I stood at the window for minutes that felt like hours. Finally, the figure turned slowly and walked back into the woods. I stayed awake until sunrise, listening for footsteps, expecting to hear the porch creak again. But the night stayed quiet except for the rain. When morning came, I checked the field. There were footprints, deep ones, leading in a straight line toward the trees. I followed them until they disappeared in the mud. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, crawling over my skin. I decided I would leave the next day. I didn't want to pack in the rain, and I didn't want to drive the muddy road in the dark. I told myself one more night would be fine. That last night was the longest night of my life. It was colder than before, and the wind kept pushing against the cabin walls like something trying to get in. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds I knew were coming. Hours passed. Then, sometime deep in the night, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, walking around the cabin the same way the footprints had circled before. They stopped at the back wall, then the side, then the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long time, there was only silence. Then something pressed against the door. Not pounding, not trying to break it, just pressing like someone testing the weight of the wood. Testing me. It stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then the pressure lifted, and the footsteps moved away, slow and steady until they faded into the trees. I didn't sleep at all after that. I waited for daylight, packed everything as fast as I could, and left the cabin without looking back. The dirt road felt narrower than before, like the forest was closing behind me. When I reached the small town, I stopped at the same gas station. The man behind the counter didn't know me, and I didn't tell him why I looked tired and pale. I fueled up, got back in my car, and drove home without stopping. It has been years since then, but the memory still sits in my mind like a cold stone. I never found out who was out there in the woods watching my cabin at night. I never went back to Idaho, and I never rented another place that far from people again. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind hits the side of my house just right, I feel that same pressure I felt on the cabin door. A slow push, a test. And even now, I know with complete clarity that whoever stood in that field watching me had visited that cabin long before I got there. And someone like that doesn't just watch anyone at random. They wait for people who come alone, far from help, far from noise, far from everything. They wait for people like I was then. And when the wind is quiet, I still wonder if they remember me. I never liked spending nights out on the farm when I was younger. There was something about the open fields, the endless horizon, and the silence that felt heavier than quiet. It felt waiting. I had inherited my uncle's small farm cabin in central Iowa after he passed. The place was old, built in the late 1950s, with dark wood paneling that had yellowed with age and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. The cabin sat on the edge of a large cornfield, surrounded by acres of flat land with nothing but the occasional fence line and windmills in the distance. It was early October 1987 when I finally decided to go up there alone. I was 24 at the time, tired of city life in Des Moines, and thought a few days on the farm would clear my head. My truck, a dusty 1978 Ford F-150, rattled as I drove down the long dirt road that led to the property. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, casting long orange streaks across the fields. By the time I arrived, the cabin was bathed in shadow, and the wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutters and making the old wooden sign creak. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. I dumped my bag in the small living room and took a flashlight into the kitchen. The propane stove clicked and hissed as I lit it, the only source of real heat since the small wood stove wouldn't hold a fire for long. I unpacked some canned goods, bread, and a small bag of coffee. I could hear the wind sweeping across the cornfields outside, the stalks rustling like dry paper. As night fell, I settled in with a mug of coffee, staring at the shadows in the corners of the cabin. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional creak of the house settling or the distant call of an owl. I tried to focus on reading, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows. Something about the way the darkness pressed against the glass made my skin crawl. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the first sound that made me stop. It was faint at first, like a scrape across the dirt outside, just past the edge of the porch. I froze, listening. The wind could carry a lot of noises, I told myself. Maybe it was an animal, raccoons, or a stray dog. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the edge of the cornfield. Nothing moved, but the scraping had definitely come from somewhere near the fence. I shook my head, convinced I was imagining things. I went back inside and locked the doors, but sleep did not come easily. Around midnight, the scraping came again, louder this time. Something heavy dragged along the dirt and gravel. I stayed under the blankets, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably a farm truck or someone passing on the road, but no trucks had been scheduled this late. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, walking around the perimeter of the cabin. They were heavy, not like a person sneaking lightly, but like someone dragging their boots through mud. I realized I could hear them more clearly from the living room window. I shined the flashlight across the yard, but the tall grass and shadows swallowed everything. Panic started to rise, but I tried to control it. I had grown up around farms. I knew sounds could trick you at night, make them seem larger than life. Minutes passed, maybe half an hour, the footsteps pacing in a loop outside, the scraping stopping and starting unpredictably. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my hunting rifle from the corner. It had been my uncle's, old but functional, and crept toward the door. I was trembling. Whoever or whatever was outside had to leave eventually, right? When I threw the door open, the wind hit me like a wall, and the flashlight caught something moving just at the edge of the cornfield. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking, and stepped forward. That's when I saw it. A tall figure crouched among the cornstalks, moving with unnatural stillness, dragging something across the dirt. Its shape was hunched and twisted, but it wasn't wearing a coat or anything human. My breath caught, and the figure froze, like it had noticed me. I couldn't see a face, just darkness, a silhouette. My instinct screamed to fire, but I hesitated. The figure started moving toward me, slow and methodical, dragging whatever it was across the ground. I could see now, it was a large burlap sack, wet and heavy, leaving a streak of dark mud behind it. My mind raced. This wasn't an animal. The size, the movements, it had to be a man, or something pretending to be one. I stumbled backward, shouting, but my voice felt small against the wind and night. The figure vanished behind the cabin, and I could hear the scraping continue on the far side, heading toward the back field. I ran inside and locked every door and window, my heart hammering. My mind went through every scenario. Robbery, a deranged person, someone hiding stolen livestock. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and the rifle. I had to get out. By 3 a.m, the sky was lightening, and the figure hadn't returned. I stayed crouched behind the cabin, waiting for enough light to see. When dawn came, I ran to the truck and didn't stop until I reached the main road. Mud on my boots, rifle still clutched in my hands. I called the sheriff once I reached town. They came out later that day, a small squad in an old cruiser, and searched the farm. They found the tracks, 2 sets, 1 human, 1 too large and heavy to be normal. They found the burlap sack in the cornfield, empty, but it had fresh soil and remnants of hay inside. No one was ever caught. The officers said it looked like someone had been using the fields and the cabin as a hideout, but they never figured out who. I didn't go back for years. When I finally did, the cabin was quiet, the fields empty, the fence leaning. The place felt smaller in the light of day, less threatening, but the memory lingered. I repaired the cabin, put up better locks, and installed a phone line that reached town. I visited the place often after that, always in the daytime, always alert. The thing I learned that October night is simple. The world can feel safe and familiar, but in the darkness, with silence pressing down, something ordinary can become terrifying. You realize just how small you are and how careful you have to be. Every creak, every shadow, every scrape of mud across dirt becomes a signal you can't ignore. I never saw that figure again, never heard the dragging sound in the night. But every time I walk the fields alone, even in the bright sun, I remember the weight of those footsteps and the shape in the corn. And I always check the corners, the shadows, the edges of the fence, just to be sure nothing has come back. The farm is mine now, fully. I work it, care for it, and live in the cabin safely. The nightmares have faded, replaced by long days and honest labor. But the memory of that night stays with me, a reminder that reality can be scarier than anything you could imagine. I had been planning the trip for months. It was November of 1998, and I had finally managed to get a week off from work. I was 26 at the time, tired of the endless hum of the city and the constant traffic noise. The plan was simple. I'd drive up to northern Montana, where I had rented a small hunting cabin tucked away in the dense forests of Flathead County. The cabin was isolated, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away and cell service was spotty at best. Perfect for getting away from everything. I packed my old Chevy Silverado the night before, filling it with essentials, firewood, canned food, water, my hunting rifle, and a few sleeping bags. I even brought along my dog, Sam, a scrappy Labrador mix I had rescued 2 years earlier. He had grown used to my outdoor adventures, and I knew he would keep me company in the long, cold nights. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours from the city, but the scenery was breathtaking. The trees had started to change, their leaves a fiery mix of orange, red, and yellow, carpeting the forest floor. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the mountains. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no sounds of cars, no distant hum of electricity, only the wind rustling through the tall pines and the occasional crow cawing somewhere overhead. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of dark, weathered logs with a tin roof and a stone chimney. Inside, it smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. Dust covered most surfaces, suggesting it had been empty for months, maybe even years. I dropped my bags, lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and let Sam explore the cabin. He sniffed every corner, occasionally letting out a low whine before settling near my feet. The first night was uneventful, though eerie. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the shadows of the trees danced on the cabin walls. I kept my rifle by the bed, just out of habit. At some point, I woke to the sound of something moving outside, near the edge of the clearing. It was subtle, a scraping noise, like branches being stepped on, but deliberate. I froze, listening, heart hammering. Sam growled low in his throat, standing alert with ears pinned forward. I strained my eyes, but the darkness outside was thick, almost impenetrable. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal wandering nearby. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area before setting up my hunting spots. I strapped on my boots, loaded my rifle, and followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The woods were beautiful, a mix of evergreens and hardwoods, their fallen leaves crunching underfoot. I spotted deer tracks and even a few turkey feathers. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, crisp and cold, and I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky was already dimming. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire and checked my supplies. That's when I noticed something odd. My firewood pile, which I had stacked neatly near the back door, had been disturbed. A few logs had been shifted, leaving small gaps in the stack. My stomach sank. I had made sure the cabin was empty when I arrived, and there was no reason anyone else should be here. I told myself it was probably Sam, knocking them over in his excitement. Still, I moved the logs back into place and double-checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked and secure. I tried to shake off the unease and went to bed, though sleep came reluctantly. The following morning, I woke early, determined to make it a productive day. I set out with Sam, heading to a ridge I had scouted the day before. The hike was grueling. Steep inclines, fallen logs, and thick underbrush, but the view from the top was worth it. I spotted a few deer grazing in the distance and made mental notes for later hunting. On my way back, though, I noticed something even more disturbing. There were footprints near the trail, not deer or elk, but human. They were partially obscured by leaves, but I could tell someone had been there recently. My heart sank. I wasn't far from the cabin, and whoever had been here could still be nearby. I gripped my rifle tighter and hurried back, Sam trotting closely beside me. When I reached the cabin, everything seemed normal at first glance. But then I noticed the mud on the porch. Someone had walked across it recently, leaving prints that led around the side of the cabin and vanished into the trees. I didn't hear anything at that moment, but a deep, gnawing sense of dread settled in my chest. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest road was miles away, and the sun was already low. I had no choice but to stay and be vigilant. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the forest made me jump. Sam stayed close, occasionally growling at the shadows outside. Around midnight, I heard it again. A deliberate sound, footsteps crunching in the leaves just beyond the clearing. I froze, my pulse racing. Whoever it was, they were careful, moving slowly, almost like they were circling the cabin. I grabbed my rifle, checked the safety, and waited, every nerve on edge. Hours passed with no further sound. As dawn broke, the tension eased slightly, though I remained on edge. I decided to investigate cautiously, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I found more signs. Discarded food wrappers, a torn piece of cloth snagged on a branch, and, most alarming, a shallow pit dug near the back of the cabin. Whoever had been here was not just passing through. They were watching, preparing, maybe even waiting. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quietly, keeping Sam close, and loaded the truck. Before I left, I double-checked the cabin. Locked doors, boarded windows, and the fireplace cold and empty. The forest around me was still and silent as I started the truck, the engine breaking the oppressive quiet. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the tree-line, half expecting to see someone following, but there was nothing, just the endless forest stretching in every direction. By the time I reached the highway, I was shaking, exhaustion and adrenaline mixing into a hollow, heavy feeling. I drove straight through to the nearest town, stopping only when I saw the bright neon lights of a gas station. I let Sam out to stretch and watched the forest in the distance, now miles behind me. I knew I had narrowly avoided a dangerous situation, though the thought lingered that whoever had been in the woods might still be out there, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. I never returned to that cabin. Years later, I heard rumors that a group of poachers had been operating in that area, sometimes targeting hunters, sometimes just stealing supplies. It made sense now, the footprints, the pit, the careful, deliberate way they had approached. I realized I had been lucky, that my vigilance and Sam's instinct had kept me safe. I still remember the smell of the pine forest, the cold bite of November air, and the way the shadows moved in that clearing. That trip left me wary of isolation, but it also taught me the value of paying attention, of trusting instincts, and of never underestimating how careful someone can be when they mean to remain unseen. The memory of that cabin, the stillness of the forest, and the sound of those footsteps in the dark never left me. Every time I hear a branch snap in the woods, my pulse quickens, and I remember that week in Montana. The week I realized that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people, real danger, and the quiet patience with which it waits. It was late October of 1998, and I had driven down a narrow, winding dirt road in northern Montana, alone, searching for a place to set up camp. I was 29, restless, and chasing solitude, the kind of isolation that city life never offered. My old Jeep rattled over roots and stones, its headlights slicing through the thickening fog that clung to the forest like a wet blanket. The sun had already disappeared behind the dense pines, leaving only the pale glow of a rising moon. Somewhere ahead, I noticed the faint outline of a cabin, half hidden behind leaning trees and overgrown brush. The cabin looked abandoned. Its wood siding had turned gray, with pieces missing in places, and the roof sagged in the middle, like it had given up on holding itself together. I could see remnants of a porch, rotted wood boards, some broken and dangling, others swallowed by weeds and tangled vines. A rusted metal bucket leaned against a corner, and a smashed window gave me a glimpse of the darkness inside. Curiosity mingled with unease. I had driven miles looking for a remote spot, and here it was, a shelter from the cold, the wind, the creeping loneliness. I parked the Jeep a little way off the road and got out, my boots crunching the dry leaves. The air smelled of damp pine and old wood, with a faint metallic tang, iron, maybe. My breath puffed out in mist, and I tried to ignore the sense of something watching me, even though there was nothing alive around for miles. I carried a flashlight, a backpack with supplies, a small hunting knife, and a rifle I rarely used. Not that I expected trouble, but out here you never knew. The first step onto the porch made a groan of protest. I had to balance carefully, testing each board before putting my full weight down. Inside, the cabin was worse than I imagined. Dust covered everything, thick enough to leave footprints where I stepped. Broken chairs lay tipped over. A small table had collapsed under its own age, and the fireplace was full of crumbling ashes. The air was heavy and stale, and I could see spider webs thick as fishing nets in the corners. A musty smell, rot, mold, and something faintly like old blood made me wrinkle my nose. I set my backpack down and moved carefully, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. On the floor, I noticed scratches in the wood, some shallow, some deep enough to splinter the surface. They didn't look recent, but they gave the place a menacing edge, as if someone or something had been desperate here once. My gut tightened. I told myself it was probably just animals. Bears, raccoons, maybe deer trying to get in for shelter. But there was a pattern, something too deliberate to be random. I decided to check the back of the cabin. The door there had lost its hinges, hanging crooked. Outside, the fog had thickened, and the forest seemed to close in. The moonlight barely penetrated the skeletal trees. I walked around slowly, stepping over fallen branches, my ears straining for the slightest sound. That's when I noticed the tracks. Boots. Human boots, old and dry, but unmistakable. They led into the woods, not toward the road. They were faint, but someone had walked here recently, or so it seemed. My heart beat faster. I wasn't alone. Inside, I tried to calm myself, scanning the room. I checked the drawers, found empty jars, some cracked. I lifted a tattered rug and found scratch marks underneath, clawing at the floorboards as though something had tried to dig its way out, or someone had tried to hide something. My mind raced. Could this place have been used for more than just a cabin? Perhaps someone lived here and then vanished, or worse. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. I set a small fire in the fireplace using old logs I found in a corner. The smoke stung my eyes, but the warmth was welcome. I ate some canned beans, the tin rattling in my hands, and drank water from my bottle. The fire crackled, throwing shadows against the walls, making the scratches and the warped wood seem alive. Every groan of the cabin sounded like footsteps outside, every snap of a branch like someone moving closer. Around midnight, I thought I heard something. Not outside, inside. A faint dragging noise, soft at first, then louder. I froze. My flashlight swept across the room, but the corners remained dark, swallowing the beam. The dragging stopped. My mind screamed that it was just my nerves, that I had pushed myself too far into the cold and the silence. I stayed awake, listening to the wind and the fire, but later a tapping began, light, deliberate, on the roof. Then again, then a slow scratch along the side of the cabin. Whoever or whatever it was patient. I grabbed my rifle, holding it in my lap. I waited. Hours passed. The tapping and scratching stopped. The fire died down. I realized that staying inside, waiting, was safer than going outside. Still, I had to know if anyone was out there. At dawn, I finally braved a look outside. The forest had changed overnight. Fog clung lower to the ground, and the tracks were clearer now, leading up the slope behind the cabin. Someone had definitely been here. Following the tracks was risky, but I had to see where they went. I packed what little I needed and stepped carefully, staying hidden behind trees. The tracks led to a shallow creek and then split in two. One set went deeper into the forest, while the other led to a small clearing. In the clearing, I froze. A makeshift shelter, crude but functional, sat under a large pine. There were remnants of a fire, charred wood, and an empty can that smelled sour. I didn't wait. I turned back toward the jeep, keeping low, moving fast but quietly. When I reached the cabin, it felt different, less oppressive but still threatening. I climbed in, threw my backpack in the jeep, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin, small and gray in the morning light. It seemed almost peaceful, yet I knew the peace was fragile. Someone had been living here, hiding, and I was lucky to leave when I did. By the time I hit the main road, my hands were shaking. My heart was still racing, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following. I drove for hours, the rising sun burning off the fog, until I reached a gas station in a small town. I bought coffee and sandwiches, trying to calm down, and called the local ranger station to report the cabin and the tracks. They were skeptical at first, but promised to check it out. Weeks later, I read a small article in the local paper. Authorities had found the cabin and discovered signs of someone living there illegally. They had been stealing supplies from nearby camps and had left before anyone arrived. No arrests had been made, but they described the place as dangerous, unstable, and full of traps. Scratches on the floors, hidden pits, and other hazards that could injure anyone unaware. I felt a chill. I had walked right into all of it and walked out, alive. I never returned to that part of the forest. Even decades later, the memory of that cabin, its smells, the scratching sounds, the fog pressing against the windows, still makes my stomach tighten. I learned that night that isolation can hide danger, that nature doesn't need to be haunted for it to feel threatening, and that curiosity, however compelling, can almost get you killed. But I also learned the value of caution, awareness, and respect for places that seem abandoned. The cabin is still there, somewhere off that dirt road in Montana. Broken, quiet, waiting. And I, more than anyone, know that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that are very real and very alive, even if no one is there to see them. I drove into northern Alberta in the autumn of 2016, wanting a week away from people. I had rented a small hunting cabin deep inside the spruce forest, the kind of place that didn't show up on phone maps unless you zoomed all the way in and waited for the signal to stumble back to life. The road leading there wasn't even paved. It turned into a rough dirt track full of potholes big enough to swallow a tire, and branches brushed against both sides of my truck like long fingers dragging along the paint. The air grew colder the farther north I went, and I kept the heater on high. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin sitting alone like an old wooden box swallowed by trees. It was small, with a slanted roof covered in dark pine needles and a porch that sagged in the middle. From the outside, it looked abandoned for at least 10 years, even though the listing said someone checked on it once every season. I carried my bags inside. The door creaked in a slow, tired way, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Dust, cold wood, and something faintly metallic, like old tools stored in a shed. The cabin had one room, a tiny kitchen connected to a bed pushed into the corner, and a narrow bathroom with a pump toilet. There were scratches along the wooden floor near the door, long ones that had dug deep into the grain. I figured they came from dragging furniture or firewood. I spent the first hour unpacking, wiping dust from the counters, and setting up my small camping stove to heat water, since the cabin didn't have electricity. I liked the silence at first. I could hear the wind moving through the tall spruce trees, making a soft rushing sound like distant waves on a beach. Every now and then, a branch snapped under the weight of something, maybe a squirrel, maybe nothing at all. Felt peaceful. But as soon as the sun began to drop behind the tree line, the forest changed. The shadows stretched long and thin, and the spruce trees looked darker, almost black, as if the whole place had sunk into a deeper kind of quiet. I felt it in my chest first, a small tightness that made me take slow breaths without realizing it. I sat on the porch steps, drinking warm water from a metal cup, watching the last bit of daylight disappear. The temperature dropped fast, quicker than seemed normal. By the time I went inside, my fingers were stiff. I locked the door even though the lock looked fragile. The kind of lock that would probably break if someone pushed hard enough. I sat on the bed writing in a small notebook I had brought with me, trying to capture the feeling of the place. I wanted the solitude, but as the night settled in, the silence felt heavier. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It was too quiet, unnaturally quiet, like everything out there was holding its breath. Sometime after midnight, I woke up without knowing why. The cabin was cold, and the thin blanket barely helped. My breath floated in front of me in pale clouds. The woods outside were still, like they had frozen. I stayed lying down for a few seconds, trying to understand what pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, soft steps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate pressure on the dead leaves and soil. Not the quick tapping of an animal. Not a deer. These were heavier, human heavy. My chest tightened. I stayed completely still. The steps moved along the front porch, the wooden boards groaning under the weight. The sound was so clear that I felt it through the floor. I waited, not sure if I was breathing too loudly. The steps stopped directly in front of the door. For at least a full minute, there was nothing except the deep hum of silence and the faint tremble of cold air in the cabin. Then something slid across the door, a long, dragging sound, like fingers brushing the wood. My stomach turned hard. The steps didn't move away. They shifted, slow and steady, as if the person was studying the cabin from the outside. The boards creaked again. Another dragging scrape across the wall, this time on the right side, near the bed. I didn't move. I didn't even swallow. The cabin felt smaller and smaller, as if the walls were folding in. I waited for the steps to continue, but they stopped. The silence that followed felt wrong. It wasn't a natural pause. It was a waiting silence, a listening silence. I imagined someone standing just inches away from me on the opposite side of the wall, just breathing gently. After several long minutes, the steps slowly moved toward the back of the cabin. I didn't hear anything after that. The forest returned to its normal sound, but softer. I stayed awake until dawn, unable to sleep. When the sun finally climbed through the trees, I went outside to check the porch. I saw footprints, not clear ones because the soil was dry, but enough to show that someone had walked there. The steps were long, spaced far apart, and heavier than any animal tracks in the area. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows and the door. My skin crawled. I kept telling myself it might have been a lost hiker, a hunter, or someone wandering at night, though no one lived within miles of the place. I should have left right then, but I told myself I might have imagined the heaviness of it, or maybe the cold made everything feel worse. I stayed another night. That was a mistake. The second night came down even colder. The sky turned dark blue, then black. The forest sounded hollow, empty in a way that made the silence feel stretched too thin. I sat inside with a lantern lit, the flame shaking whenever I shifted. My hands felt restless, like they knew something before the rest of me did. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, I heard breathing outside the window, slow, steady, controlled. It came from the left side of the cabin, where the glass was old and thin. My heartbeat thumped against my ribs. The breathing was so close that I could almost feel it vibrate through the wood. Then the breathing stopped. Something tapped on the window. A single, slow tap. Not loud, not sharp, just deliberate. Then another tap. I felt every hair on my body rise. I didn't move. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours until light began to grow outside. When morning finally came, I found more footprints outside the window. The kind that didn't come close to matching my shoe size or any animal shape. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. My hands shook the entire time. Even after getting into the truck, I felt eyes on me, though the forest stayed still. I drove out of the clearing faster than my truck was meant to go on that kind of road, every bump and rattle echoing through my chest. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped. For a long moment, I sat there gripping the wheel, breathing hard, trying to understand what had happened. There was no explanation that felt satisfying. No reason someone would wander around a remote cabin 2 nights in a row, silently circling it, watching it, breathing against the windows. I never reported it. I didn't want to explain it out loud, but I never went back, and I never rented another cabin that deep in the woods again. Even now, whenever I think about those nights, I don't think about what I heard. I think about what I didn't hear. The forest holding its breath. The waiting silence. The way those steps moved, slow, calm, patient. Not lost, not confused, just watching, and knowing I had nowhere else to go. That is the part that stayed with me the longest. I had been driving for hours through the dry, cracked roads of northern Arizona. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 28, finally taking the break I desperately needed from the chaos of city life in Phoenix. The plan was simple: rent a remote cabin, disconnect, write, and clear my mind. I didn't care that the place was miles from the nearest town. I wanted silence, and this cabin promised it. The roads had been nothing more than dirt tracks, twisting and turning through the canyons and sparse forests. By the time I spotted the cabin, the sun was already low, bleeding orange through the gaps in the juniper trees. The cabin was small, wooden, and weathered, with a stone chimney that suggested someone had built it decades ago. The kind of place where you could feel history in the air. The first thing I noticed was how utterly isolated it was. There wasn't a single car or house in sight, and the only sounds were the faint whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional caw of a crow. I pulled the truck up and got out, stretching and taking in the sight. The porch sagged slightly under years of neglect, but the door opened easily. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and a hint of smoke from long extinguished fires. The cabin had a small kitchen with a rusty stove, a living area with a sagging couch, and one bedroom with a thin mattress on a bare frame. A stack of firewood was piled haphazardly near the door. It wasn't luxurious, but it was perfect for what I needed. I unpacked my bag, lighting a small kerosene lamp in the center of the living area. That's when I noticed it. Scratches on the floorboards near the back door. They were fresh, deep gouges in the wood that didn't make sense for a place that had been abandoned for so long. I frowned, feeling a prickle of unease, but told myself it was probably raccoons or some other animal. That night, I slept with the windows cracked, the air hot but dry. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of twigs snapping outside. My first thought was a coyote or maybe a stray dog. I got up and looked out the window. The moon had risen, casting a pale silver glow over the land. First, there was nothing. Then I saw it. A figure, crouched low, moving unnaturally between the trees. Its movements were wrong, too fluid and too precise, like it was studying me as much as I was studying it. I froze. It had eyes that reflected the moonlight, too bright and too aware. Its body was human-like in shape, but its limbs looked wrong. Too long, too thin, with joints that bent at odd angles. I didn't breathe, hoping it wouldn't notice me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it stood on two legs, elongated in a way that no human should be able to stand. Then it tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, and disappeared into the darkness. Sleep never returned after that. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening. The snapping twigs came again, closer this time, circling the cabin, stopping, then moving away. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside with a flashlight. There were tracks deep, human-like, but with toes that were too long, too narrow, and claws instead of nails. They circled the cabin multiple times before disappearing into the desert scrub. The next few days were a blur of unease. I kept hearing things. Scratching at the walls, the faint shuffle of footsteps outside, and sometimes a low, guttural growl that didn't match any animal I'd ever heard. I tried to write, tried to tell myself I was imagining it. But every time I looked out the window, I felt eyes on me, always just beyond the treeline. By the third night, I realized I had to do something. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be testing me, learning me. I barricaded the cabin as best I could, stacking firewood against the doors and closing every shutter. I found an old hunting rifle in a corner of the cabin, rusted but functional. I loaded it with the only rounds I had, my hands shaking. That night, the creature came closer. I could hear it scratching at the wood, sniffing around the perimeter, growling low and menacing. I sat in the corner with the rifle across my lap, sweating, heart pounding. Then it spoke, in a voice that mimicked my own, but distorted, broken, and guttural. My name, said my name. I realized then that it wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something that could imitate humans, something that had been watching me for days. I stayed frozen until the sun began to rise. When the first light touched the desert, the creature retreated. I knew it wasn't gone, just waiting, patient. I packed my bag immediately and left, driving as fast as I dared along the dirt roads, constantly checking the mirrors for movement. It wasn't until I stopped in a small town several miles away that I allowed myself to breathe. I told no one about what I saw. I knew no one would believe me, but I kept the rifle. I never returned to the cabin, and I never went into that part of the desert alone again. Years later, I would learn from a local that the land I had been on was rumored to be cursed or haunted in the old Navajo legends. Skinwalkers, they called them. I didn't know if the stories were true or if I had just been lucky. All I knew was that whatever I saw in that cabin, whatever circled me at night and whispered my name, was real, and it was still out there. I don't write about it often, but when I do, I make sure every word is careful, every detail accurate. Because the one thing I learned that night is that skinwalkers don't just exist in myths. They exist in reality, and they are patient, intelligent, and terrifyingly aware. I'll never forget the sound of claws scraping the wood, the reflection of those unnatural eyes in the moonlight, or the feeling that something could be standing just outside my door, waiting for me to make a mistake. Now, when I hear rustling outside my own house in Phoenix, even decades later, I tense up. I know the world is full of stories and legends, but sometimes they are real, and sometimes they are looking right at you, just beyond the edge of the light. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small rental cabin deep inside the northern woods of Montana in late October of 2019. I had been working long nights at the warehouse in Billings, and after months of non-stop shifts and stress, I felt like I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere far from noise, people, and the constant pressure of life. I found the cabin online. It looked simple, clean, and isolated enough that I could breathe without hearing another voice or seeing another building across the street. That was exactly what I wanted. I didn't think much about the fact that the listing had only 2 photos and barely any description. I didn't care as long as it was far away from everything. The drive up the mountain took almost 3 hours. The paved road turned into gravel, then dirt, then something that looked like a forgotten trail carved into the side of the forest. Tall pines pressed in from both sides, and the deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to swallow the sunlight. I kept telling myself that it was perfect, that this silence was what I needed. But part of me felt something else, something small at first, like a faint pressure at the back of the mind, the kind that you ignore because you don't want to deal with it. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dropping behind the ridge. The place looked older than the pictures suggested. The wooden boards were dark from years of weather, and the roof sagged a little in the middle. But it was still standing, and there was a working lock on the door, so I unloaded my bag and stepped inside. The interior smelled like coal dust and old wood. There was a small kitchen, a single bed pushed against a wall, 1 table, 1 chair, and a small stove for heat. Nothing extra, nothing welcoming. It was exactly the kind of emptiness I thought I wanted. At first, the silence felt calming. I walked around the cabin, placed my things, checked the windows, and took in the long stretch of darkening forest outside. The tree line seemed to bend inward like a wall, and I could barely see 50 yards through the trunks before everything turned into black layers. I stood there for a long moment, staring into that darkness, feeling like the forest was staring back. I brushed it off as tiredness. That first night, everything was fine until about an hour after midnight. I had been lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the first sound. It wasn't loud, just a single sharp crunch somewhere outside the cabin, like someone stepping on a thick branch. I froze. My mind tried to convince me it was an animal, maybe a deer or something heavier moving in the brush. But the sound wasn't followed by any other movement. Came once, then silence. The kind of silence that tightens your chest. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening for anything else. The stove ticked softly as it cooled. The wind brushed the trees once in a while, but nothing else came. I eventually drifted off, though it was a shallow sleep filled with a strange tension in my stomach. In the morning, the forest looked normal again. Cold, quiet, still. I tried to shake off the uneasiness by going for a short walk around the property. I circled behind the cabin and saw something odd near the back wall. A long mark in the dirt, like something had been dragged. It wasn't deep enough to be a clear trail, but it was long, almost 6 feet, running parallel to the wall before disappearing into the brush. I crouched down to check it closer, trying to understand what could have made it. It didn't look like an animal track. There were no claw prints, no hoof marks, just a smooth line, as if something heavy had been pulled slowly. I tried to explain it away as maybe a fallen limb someone had moved long ago, even though the dirt looked freshly disturbed. The second night was worse. I lay in bed again, keeping the stove low so I wouldn't have to get up often to feed it. Around midnight, the same sound came again, the sharp crack of something stepping on wood. But this time it wasn't alone. A few seconds later came another, then another, slow, spaced apart, like measured steps circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. My mind raced through every animal that lived in these woods. Even a large elk didn't walk with slow, deliberate intervals like that. This sounded heavier, more controlled. I stared at the door, at the thin wood separating me from whatever was outside. I could feel the weight of the footsteps through the air. Every hair on my body was standing. I waited, barely blinking, until the sounds finally faded into the trees. But even after they stopped, I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By the third day, I was exhausted but refusing to let fear ruin the trip. I kept telling myself that the woods were full of strange noises, especially at night, and I was just overthinking it. But something in me knew I wasn't imagining the pace and pressure of those steps. I stayed close to the cabin most of the day, gathering fallen branches and splitting some wood. While looking for thicker pieces behind the cabin, I noticed something new. A second drag mark. This one was deeper and closer to the building, and next to it were 2 faint impressions in the dirt, oval and slightly uneven, almost like footprints, but not clear enough for me to be sure. I felt cold despite the midday sun. When night came, I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright on the bed, wrapped in my jacket, listening to every shift of the wind. Hours passed, and I started to think maybe it wouldn't return. Then, sometime around 3 a.m., came the sound that made my stomach drop. A slow, steady scrape across the wooden wall of the cabin. The sound traveled across the outside boards, from the far corner toward the window. Not fast, not random, a slow drag like fingertips or something rough being pulled along the wood. I felt my breath get stuck in my throat. The window was only a few feet from the bed. I stared at it, imagining something just outside the glass. The scraping stopped right beneath it. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. My pulse hammered so loud I felt it in my ears. I sat completely still for what felt like hours until the first signs of dawn lightened the window. When the sun rose enough to brighten the forest, I stepped outside. My hands shook the moment I saw the wall beneath the window. For long marks ran across the boards, deep enough to carve away splinters. They weren't claw marks. They weren't tool marks. They looked like something uneven and rough had pressed against the wood with force and dragged slowly. That was the moment I decided I was done. I packed my bag as fast as I could, threw everything into the truck, and didn't bother cleaning up anything. I felt watched the entire time, like something was just inside the tree line, waiting for me to stay a little longer. I kept glancing at the forest, expecting to see movement. Nothing showed itself, but the pressure of being observed never left. The drive down the mountain felt twice as long as the drive up. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see something step into the road. Only when I hit the main highway did the tension begin to loosen from my chest. When I got home, I reported the cabin listing as unsafe and refused to explain the details. I didn't want to relive it. Days later, I checked the listing again out of curiosity. It had been removed entirely, as if it had never existed. I never returned to those woods, and I never rented another remote cabin again. Whatever walked around that place at night, whatever dragged itself along the walls and left those marks, it wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was something real, something alive, something that knew I was alone and far from help. And if I hadn't left on that fourth morning, I believe with complete certainty that I wouldn't have made it out of there at all. I learned one thing from that week. Silence in the deep woods isn't peaceful. It's a warning, and I'll never ignore it again. It was the fall of 1998, and I had just turned 29. I had recently been transferred to a small national park in northern Montana, far from the crowded trails and constant tourists I was used to in Yellowstone. The park was expansive, a mix of dense pine forests, craggy ridges, and deep, shadowed valleys. I was assigned to a remote ranger cabin near a seldom-used trail that hikers only mentioned in passing on old maps. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. Rough-hewn logs, a tin roof that rattled in the wind, and a small wood stove that promised warmth if I could keep it fed. It had no electricity except for an old generator that worked sporadically, and the nearest ranger station was a full 30 miles away over dirt roads that could become impassable after even a light rain. The first few days were quiet. The forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife, squirrels scratching in the underbrush, the distant calls of hawks circling overhead, and the soft rustle of wind through the pines. I had stocked up with canned food, water, and firewood, knowing I would be mostly on my own for at least a week at a time. I liked the solitude, the way the forest seemed to breathe around me, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice its quiet rhythm. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in. The clouds hung low and heavy, and the wind picked up, making the trees groan like old men in pain. Rain began to fall in sheets, hammering the tin roof of the cabin. I had the stove lit and was sitting on the worn cot, reading a maintenance log of the park's old trails, when I heard it, a faint, scratching sound at the edge of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some small animal, but then I realized the pattern was too deliberate, almost cautious, like it was testing me, figuring out if I was aware. I put on my boots and grabbed my flashlight, stepping carefully outside onto the slick, muddy ground. The storm made visibility nearly zero, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the raindrops like tiny stars caught in a net. Nothing, just the forest. The wind was loud enough to drown out most other sounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I went back inside, shaking it off, telling myself that after a decade in the park service, I was just imagining things. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and slow, crunching through the wet underbrush around the cabin. My heart sank. There shouldn't have been anyone in this section of the park. The nearest ranger patrol was 20 miles away. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The steps stopped. Then, faint scratching at the back door, a sound like someone testing the lock. I reached for my rifle that I kept loaded near the stove and quietly approached the door. I didn't open it. Couldn't. I could only hear the wind, the rain, and the faint, unsettling scratching that didn't belong to any animal I had ever encountered. The next morning, I inspected the perimeter. The mud around the cabin had footprints, large, booted, and not mine. They came from the tree-line, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the woods. No one would leave tracks like that without being careful, especially in this kind of wet soil. Whoever or whatever had been here had been deliberate, knowing the terrain. For the next 2 days, I kept the cabin locked down, only stepping out to gather more firewood and checked the traps I had set for wildlife research. Each time I went outside, I felt eyes on me. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, like the trees themselves were leaning closer, trying to see me. One afternoon, I noticed my tools had been moved. My hatchet was leaning against the wrong wall, and a small pack I had left outside was gone. I followed a trail of disturbed leaves, thinking maybe a bear had been curious, but there was no wildlife sign, just prints, human prints, and they were fresh. By the fourth day, I realized I wasn't dealing with a random trespasser. Someone had been watching me, following my movements, learning the cabin, the patterns I had developed. That night, I slept with the rifle across my chest and my flashlight beside me. Around 2 in the morning, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. Then the sound of something heavy hitting the tin roof. A branch, I hoped, but it was too precise, too targeted. My heart was hammering. I could feel the sweat soaking my shirt, but I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the door. I waited until they started jiggling the lock and then shouted, loud enough to carry over the storm. No response. I fired a warning shot into the ground outside. That was enough. The noise stopped abruptly. Footsteps receded. Silence returned, but I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I packed the essentials: food, water, my rifle, and my radio, and left the cabin, hiking down the slippery trail toward the main road. I planned to report the intrusion and request backup before returning. The forest felt different that morning. Not quiet, but tense, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Halfway down the trail, I saw something that made my stomach twist: fresh footprints again. Not in the mud this time, but pressed into the soft moss along the path. They were close, following me, and as I slowed, I realized the prints matched my boots almost perfectly, except slightly larger. Someone had been deliberately copying me, trying to predict my movements. I pushed on, adrenaline carrying me down the steep trail. When I finally reached the ranger station near the road, I found 2 other rangers waiting. One of them, older and more seasoned, looked at me with understanding. "You weren't imagining it," he said quietly. "That area has had some problems. People trying to live off the land, stay hidden. They watch the cabins, see what we do. You got lucky. You didn't meet them face to face." With the help of the other rangers, we went back to the cabin the next day. The footprints were gone, but there were signs someone had stayed, using the firewood, moving supplies, even sleeping in corners of the cabin. Whoever it was had vanished before we arrived, but the forest still held that same heavy, watching tension. After that week, the Park Service installed motion sensors around the cabin and established a schedule for more frequent patrols. I was allowed to return, but I never stayed alone for more than a day. Even years later, when I would visit the area, I couldn't shake the memory of those nights. The scratching, the steps, the feeling that I wasn't the one in control. The forest hadn't been alive in the way I loved. It had been occupied, watched, and aware of me in a way no wilderness should ever feel. The cabin is still there. I've hiked past it sometimes, long after I left the park, and it looks peaceful from the trail. But I know better. Inside those walls, the quiet isn't natural. The shadow in the corner, the footprint in the moss outside, the rearranged tools. Those are reminders that even the most remote, isolated places aren't immune to human eyes. People can hide anywhere, wait, and watch. And in a forest like that, in a storm like that, you realize how small and exposed you truly are. I survived, of course. I reported everything, and the park eventually captured the trespassers. A small group of individuals who had been living illegally in the forest, observing the cabins and sometimes taking supplies. Nothing supernatural, nothing unexplainable, just human beings, patient and dangerous in their own quiet way. The relief wasn't in catching them. It was a knowing that what had terrified me wasn't something beyond reason, but something all too real. The forest returned to its normal rhythm eventually, and I learned to respect it even more. Not just the wildlife, but the humans it could conceal. It was the fall of 1998 when I found myself driving along a barely marked dirt road in the remote outskirts of Vermont. I was 24, freshly out of college, with a restless desire to escape the city and see the world, or at least a part of it where the air smelled like pine and damp earth instead of exhaust fumes and coffee. I'd heard about an old cabin tucked near a graveyard, supposedly abandoned for decades, and something about the idea of solitude appealed to me. I wanted to write, to sketch, and to lose myself in a place that didn't breathe with the constant hum of life. The road was narrower than I expected, flanked by thick woods that filtered the low afternoon sunlight into greenish-gold streaks across the cracked windshield. Every now and then, the car would bounce over a hidden dip or scrape a loose rock, and I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. A sense of unease had been creeping up on me for the last 20 minutes, but I chalked it up to unfamiliarity. That and the graveyard. I saw it finally. A small clearing where the earth sloped gently downward. At the far end, weathered wooden crosses jutted unevenly from the ground, leaning like they were struggling against time itself. The cabin sat near the edge of the graveyard, a two-story wooden skeleton with rotting siding, the roof sagging in the middle. Windows were dark, cracked, and dusty, reflecting the late afternoon sun in weird angles. I parked my car on a patch of hardened mud, listening to the soft whistle of wind through dead leaves. The air smelled damp, sour, and metallic, a mixture of fallen leaves, wet wood, and something faintly like rusted iron. I stepped out, boots crunching on loose gravel, and approached the cabin. The front porch sagged dangerously, one board giving slightly under my weight. I shivered, brushing my fingers across the railing. Splinters tore at my skin, and I felt a small prick of pain along my palm. The door was partially ajar. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of silence pressing down from the surrounding trees and the old stones beyond. There were no birds, no insects buzzing loudly, just an occasional creak from a distant branch. Inside, the air was colder. Dust motes floated like tiny sparks in the weak shafts of sunlight. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I could see remnants of old furniture. A table with missing legs, a chair overturned, and a stove with rust crawling over its surface. The smell inside was sharper, a mix of mold, decay, and something metallic, like old blood. I had my backpack with me, and I placed my notebook and pencil on the table. I wanted to draw, to capture the texture of the walls, the slant of the roof, the shadows pooling in corners. As I worked, I became aware of a sound outside, faint but definite. Footsteps, not human footsteps pacing with rhythm, but a dragging, scraping sound on the dirt. My chest tightened. I stopped drawing and listened. The sound seemed to move around the cabin, circling, shifting. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer caught in underbrush or a raccoon foraging, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too careful. It stopped suddenly. Silence again. I forced myself to breathe normally, rationalizing that the isolation of the place was playing tricks on me. I had no cell reception, no neighbors for miles, just me, the cabin, and the graveyard. The thought of the graves made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The stones were ancient, many of them cracked, toppled over, or illegible. I walked closer to the edge of the cemetery, notebook in hand, to sketch the uneven lines of the headstones. That's when I noticed the footprints, muddy, fresh, and leading from the tree-line toward the cabin. Someone had been here recently. My stomach tightened, and a cold sweat broke along my spine. I didn't want to leave, and I didn't want to stay. But instinctively, I turned back to the cabin. The front door, which I remembered being ajar, was now fully open, swinging slightly as if pushed by a hand. I froze, listening. The dragging sound returned, louder this time, accompanied by the soft thud of wood against wood. Whoever or whatever was outside was close. I ducked into the cabin, heart hammering, and grabbed a broken chair leg for some sense of security. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but curiosity held me there, frozen near the doorway. The shadows outside shifted. A figure moved near the tree-line, just beyond the graveyard. I couldn't make out features, just a shape hunched and careful, almost stalking the edge of the clearing. My mind raced. Was it a hunter? A squatter? Someone living here all along? I realized my voice would carry if I screamed, and calling for help was useless. The nearest house was miles away. The figure stayed there for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only 10 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods, leaving the dragging sound behind. A small branch snapped far off, and I knew it wasn't coming back. I lowered the chair leg, still trembling, and took a moment to breathe, forcing myself to calm down. By the time dusk fell, I decided I couldn't stay the night. The isolation, the graveyard, the figure I couldn't explain, it was too much. I packed my things quickly, leaving the notebook on the table for the cabin to swallow, and stepped outside. The wind had picked up, carrying a sharp, bitter chill. The forest seemed alive with rustling and whispers of leaves, but no one was there. I kept my eyes on the dirt road, my boots crunching on gravel, and didn't look back. The drive out was tense, every shadow at the edge of my headlights making my heart skip a beat. I imagined the figure following me, crouched in the darkness, until I finally reached a main road. The first signs of civilization, streetlights, passing cars, distant houses, felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I didn't stop driving until I reached a motel several towns over, where I parked and finally allowed myself to shake, to feel the adrenaline drain out of my body. I never returned to that cabin. I looked it up later through county records. No one officially lived there for decades. The graveyard was small, private, and technically abandoned, though maintained enough to not be swallowed entirely by forest. Whatever had been there that day, whoever had moved through the trees, had vanished without a trace. I told myself it didn't matter. Some things in life exist to remind you of your vulnerability, to remind you that not all fear is imagined. Months later, I went through the notebook I'd left behind. A friend had retrieved it from the cabin when they visited the area. I refused to go myself. The sketches were crude, the angles off, but the pages captured the essence of the place. Crooked headstones, the sagging porch, the empty, hollow windows. And on one page, there was a faint smudge of mud, not mine, not from me, which reminded me, again, of how close I had been to something unknown. That realization stayed with me for years. A brush with the unknown, not supernatural, but real, raw, and utterly human. I never felt the urge to return, nor did I feel the need to. The fear that day had been tangible, measurable, and leaving it behind in the fall air of Vermont had been the only rational choice. Some experiences, I realized, are meant to be survived, not revisited. It was the summer of 2017 when I first got the tip about the cabin. I was 29, a uniformed officer in a small rural town in Oregon, and I had been transferred to the Special Investigations Unit just a few months prior. Most of my days were spent digging through petty theft reports or shadowing known drug users in the county. But this assignment had the weight of something bigger, something dangerous. The tip came from a local hunter, an older man who knew the forest like the back of his hand. He said he'd spotted unusual activity in a cabin deep in the Willamette National Forest, near the North Fork Trail. The place wasn't on any public maps and had been abandoned for years, yet there were signs of someone living there recently. Smoke from a chimney, fresh tire tracks, and lights at night. I spent days preparing. I mapped the area using satellite images, noting possible escape routes and sightlines. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense pine and fir trees that blocked most of the sunlight even in mid-afternoon. I learned that the suspects were involved in a criminal operation, drug distribution, illegal firearms, and possibly money laundering. The weight of the responsibility hit me as I packed my gear. My service pistol was loaded, my radio checked, and my flashlight batteries were fresh. Most importantly, I had Max, my K9 partner, a German Shepherd with an unmatched sense of danger. He had been with me for 4 years, and his presence was comforting, even in moments when fear clutched at my chest. We approached the forest in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the trees. The air was thick with humidity, mixed with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I parked the unmarked SUV at the edge of a clearing and double-checked our gear. Max sniffed the air, ears raised, tail stiff. I could feel the tension in him mirroring my own. Every instinct in both of us was on high alert. The trek to the cabin wasn't far on paper, about a mile, but the underbrush was thick, twisting around roots and rocks. I had to move carefully, keeping my boots silent, listening to every snap of twig and rustle of leaves. Max was ahead of me, silent but precise, his paws barely making a sound on the forest floor. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. Birds had stopped singing, squirrels had disappeared, and even the wind seemed hesitant. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time we reached the cabin, it was nearly dusk. The structure was small and made of rough timber, with a metal roof that had begun to rust. Smoke curled from a narrow chimney, dark and thick, carrying a smell of burned wood and chemicals. I crouched behind a fallen log, using it as cover to survey the perimeter. There were no vehicles in sight, but I noticed footprints in the mud, recent, heavy boots, not hunting boots. This was professional. Someone here knew how to cover tracks, how to make the forest work for them. I called it in over the radio, keeping my voice low. Perimeter clear, visual on the cabin. Suspects inside, preparing to breach. The response was a silent click. No backup yet, the operation had been fast-tracked, and they trusted my judgment on this. I signaled Max, and he responded instantly, a slight whine and a wag of his tail. I approached the cabin slowly, keeping to the shadows. The front door was reinforced, a steel bar across it, but there were side windows. I crouched low, peeking through the grime-smeared glass. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a few hanging bulbs. I could see tables stacked with baggies, scales, and a small safe. There were 3 men inside, all armed, moving quickly, talking in hushed tones. Their attention focused on whatever was being counted or packaged. One of them had a rifle resting against the wall. The plan was simple. Max would breach first, creating a distraction, and I would follow, securing the suspects while minimizing risk. I gave the signal and the world erupted. Max barreled through the door, growling, teeth bared. The men inside were caught off guard, their shouts echoing through the cabin. I kicked the door fully open, weapon ready, and dove inside. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of chemicals. The chaos was immediate. One man lunged at me with a crowbar, but Max intercepted him, knocking him off balance. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling just to assert control. The other 2 tried to run for the back, but I had anticipated this. One slammed into a wall, stunned, while I wrestled the third to the floor. Max barked, circling the struggling men, his teeth never showing, but the threat clear. After a tense 30 minutes, the suspects were restrained. I cuffed them and conducted a quick search. The cabin was a mess. chemicals for drug production, stacks of cash hidden under floorboards, and an arsenal of firearms tucked away in corners and under beds. The forest outside was silent again, but the adrenaline in my veins made it feel like the world was vibrating. I radioed in the success of the operation and waited for backup. While we waited, I took a moment to walk through the cabin again. Alone now, Max stayed at the door, alert. I examined the evidence, making mental notes for the investigators. The operation was risky, but precise. Everything had gone according to plan, and yet the tension lingered. The forest had a way of keeping you aware of how small and vulnerable you were. Hours later, when backup arrived, we loaded the suspects into police vehicles and secured the scene. The sun had fully set, leaving the forest bathed in shadows. Max and I stayed behind for a final sweep, making sure nothing had been left behind. No hidden entrances, no overlooked dangers. Everything was as it should be. Driving back, the forest receded behind us, dark and silent, and the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a tired satisfaction. The operation had worked. No one was seriously injured, no one had escaped, and the criminal operation was dismantled. The evidence would take weeks to process, and the men would face serious charges, but the forest was quiet again, as if the chaos had never existed. By the time we reached town, the first hints of dawn were breaking over the mountains. I let Max jump into the back seat, his coat damp with sweat and mud, and I drove in silence, reflecting on the night. There had been fear, there had been danger, but there had also been control, training, and trust between me and my partner, and in the planning that had brought us there. It was over and we had survived. The forest would keep its secrets, but that night, I had uncovered one of them, and the law had been served. And in the quiet moments after, when I was alone at the station, paperwork done and coffee cold, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The cabin was no longer a hidden hub for criminals. The forest, dark and imposing, had returned to its normal rhythm, and I had been part of it. Max nudged my hand as if to remind me that the work was never done. But for now, there was peace. The memory of that night stayed with me, not as a story of fear, but as a testament to preparation, courage, and the bond between a cop and his K-9 partner. Every detail, the smell of smoke and chemicals, the sound of splintered wood, the feel of mud under my boots, was etched in my mind. And I knew that no matter what I faced next, that night in the cabin had prepared me for it, in ways nothing else ever could. It was the winter of 2017 when I found myself driving the old pickup through the winding roads of northern Vermont, a place that felt more remote than anywhere I had ever been. The forest stretched endlessly on either side, bare trees clawing at the gray sky, and snow lay thick over the ground, muffling everything except the crunch of my tires on the frozen dirt. I was 38, freshly divorced, and carrying more regret than I had ever admitted to anyone. My ex-wife, Clara, had owned a small cabin up here, inherited from her late uncle, a man who had died with more bitterness than warmth in his bones. After the divorce, the cabin had gone back to her, but she had left it locked and unvisited for years. I had asked if I could come up to clear some of her old stuff, but she had only shrugged in a message and said it was fine if I wanted. Something about that fine gnawed at me. It was distant, almost cold. I arrived at the edge of a clearing late in the afternoon. The cabin, a squat, weathered building, leaned slightly to one side as if it had grown tired of standing. Its wood was gray and rough, the kind that splintered when touched, and the roof sagged under the weight of snow. I parked and climbed out, the cold biting through my jacket and gloves. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes the normal sound of your own breathing feel too loud. I walked up to the front door and found the lock had frozen shut. I leaned against the wood, shaking the frost off my gloves, and kicked at the base. It gave way with a reluctant crack, and I pushed it open. The smell hit me first: dust, decay, and a faint sourness that could only come from years of neglect. Snow had blown in through a gap in the roof, forming a small drift in the corner of the main room. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the oppressive emptiness of the place. The interior was small, a single room that had served as a living area, kitchen, and sleeping space. A thin layer of dust covered everything. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, rusted and cold. The furniture that remained was sparse: a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a mattress that had seen better decades. Papers and magazines were scattered on the floor, curling from moisture and age. I started picking things up, shoving debris into a box I had brought, trying to make the space feel less like a tomb and more like a cabin someone had once lived in. I set the box down after about an hour and decided to check the rest of the property. There was a small shed behind the cabin, its door hanging on a single hinge. Inside, I found old tools, a broken wheelbarrow, and a stack of firewood that was damp and heavy. I carried a few pieces inside to dry by the stove. Every sound in that place seemed exaggerated: the creak of the floorboards under my weight, the wind rattling against the windows, the soft patter of snow melting off the roof. I realized I was holding my breath a lot, my heart hammering in a way that made me feel unsteady. By late afternoon, the light was waning. I had barely touched the cleaning. The cabin seemed endless in its mess and decay. I decided to start a fire in the stove to make it warmer, but the chimney was blocked, probably with a nest or debris. I tried anyway, shoving some paper and kindling inside. The fire sputtered and smoked, filling the room with black clouds, and I coughed, waving at the air with my gloved hands. I gave up and sat down on the cold mattress, pulling my jacket tighter. As darkness fell, the isolation hit me fully. Out here, the forest swallowed sound. I could see nothing beyond the rim of trees, and the only light came from my small flashlight and the weak winter sunset. My mind started wandering, memories of Clara, our fights, the endless nights of silence that had ended us. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the work ahead, but then I noticed something. Footprints in the snow outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading around the side of the cabin and stopping at the edge of the woods. My stomach tightened. There shouldn't be anyone here. The nearest road was miles away, and it was too cold and isolated for casual hikers. I told myself it could be an animal, but the spacing and depth were human, and they were too deliberate to belong to a deer or fox. I moved cautiously to the window, peering through the frost and snow. The forest beyond seemed still, almost unreal in its quiet. My breath fogged the glass as I watched the dark shapes of the trees. Then I heard it, a faint rustle, like someone brushing against branches, moving closer. Panic rose in my chest. I grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the shed and pressed myself against the wall, trying to think clearly. Whoever or whatever it was, I had to stay calm. Time stretched endlessly. The rustling stopped and started again. Shadows moved just beyond my sight line, fleeting and fast. I didn't dare open the door. My phone had no signal, and I had only a few hours of light left. I decided to barricade the cabin best I could with the furniture, sliding the chairs against the door and pushing the table against the chairs. My hands were shaking violently. I spent the night crouched in the corner of the cabin, the wrench clutched in my hands, every sound magnified. Every snap of a branch outside made me jump. My mind raced through possibilities: robbers, drifters, someone who knew the cabin had been empty. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, but it was useless. The cold seeped into my bones, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. I thought about giving up and running, but stepping outside would be suicide in the dark. with no clear path through the forest. Dawn finally came. Pale sunlight seeped through the windows, painting the snow outside in shades of pink and gray. I hesitated before approaching the door, fearing what I might see. When I finally dared to peek, I saw tracks leading away from the cabin into the deeper forest. They weren't numerous, and there was no sign of anyone still nearby. Whatever had been out there had retreated. Relief washed over me in an almost physical sense. I slumped against the wall, exhausted, cold, and still trembling. After breakfast, I decided to pack up my boxes and leave. I moved slowly, checking the perimeter as I went, still aware of every sound. The forest had returned to its usual silence, and the only tracks in the snow were mine and the ones from the previous night, fading as the wind blew. I locked the cabin as best I could and left a note for Clara explaining what I had cleared and what remained. I didn't want her knowing about the tracks. I doubted she would believe me anyway. The drive back down the mountain was quiet, reflective. The fear of the night had left me, replaced by a lingering unease and an appreciation for the fragility of being alone in such isolation. The cabin, abandoned as it was, remained intact, a small testament to human presence in the middle of endless woods. I didn't return after that winter, but the memory stayed with me. The cold, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, and the realization that solitude can be as terrifying as any person. In the end, I understood something about myself that winter. Fear isn't always about what's supernatural or imagined. It's about vulnerability, being cut off from the world, and realizing how small and fragile you are when there's no one to help. The cabin, Clara's old cabin, had been a place of confrontation with that fear, and I left it behind changed, aware of the quiet, relentless reality of being truly alone. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to build a small cabin in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 27 then, tired of the constant noise and pressure of city life in Boston. My father had left me a small inheritance, enough to buy a patch of land far from any town or road, and I had spent the better part of a summer scouting the area. I found a clearing about an acre wide, surrounded by thick pine and birch trees, the ground wet from countless autumn storms, with a little creek cutting through one corner. It was isolated, perfect for the solitude I craved. I started construction in late September, hauling lumber and supplies from the nearest town, nearly 20 miles away on a dirt road that had begun to wash away after the first heavy rains. I had no experience as a carpenter beyond a few weekend projects with my uncle, but I was determined. The cabin was small, just enough room for a cot, a wood stove, and a workbench. I framed the walls and roof, nailed weatherproof siding, and installed a simple door and a few rough windows. I worked every day, sometimes from dawn until dusk, my hands raw, muscles sore, the smell of wet pine and sawdust constant in the air. By late October, the cabin was almost done. Walls sturdy, roof tight, windows fitted, and the stove installed. Only the interior remained, and I had enough plywood and lumber to finish it before the first snowfall. The night it rained was unlike any other I had experienced. The sky darkened by mid-afternoon, clouds rolling low and heavy, pressing against the treetops. By 6 in the evening, a steady, cold rain had begun, drumming on the roof, pooling in the clearing, turning the dirt paths to slick, brown mud. I was alone as usual. The nearest neighbor was nearly 3 miles away over rough, twisting dirt roads, and I had no cell phone. This was before anyone I knew had reliable mobile coverage. The cabin smelled of wet wood and pine resin. I had lit the stove, the fire crackling and hissing as I added logs, the warmth pushing back the chill seeping through the walls. I had finished hanging the last interior shelves and stacking my supplies when I noticed the sound of the rain had changed. At first, it was the same steady patter on the roof and the puddles outside. Then, beneath that, I could hear something heavier, dragging over wet leaves, snapping small branches as it moved closer. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. I had seen plenty of wildlife around the area during the day: foxes, porcupines, and the occasional black bear. But this was different. The sound was deliberate, slow, too heavy for anything small. It circled the cabin, stopping briefly, then moving again, just beyond the thin line of trees that surrounded my clearing. I tightened the firewood stack near the stove and grabbed my flashlight. I had a hunting rifle leaning against the wall, loaded, safety on. I edged to the window, wetting the edges with my fingertips to see outside without letting too much light escape, the rain running down the glass in streaks. The clearing was dark, almost black, and the rain blurred everything into a gray, moving wall. But I could see it. Someone or something, standing at the far edge of the clearing, tall, hunched slightly, not moving as the rain fell around it. My pulse jumped and I swallowed hard. I reminded myself no one else knew I was here, so any human presence this far out would have had to walk a long distance in the rain. Why would anyone do that? Minutes passed. I couldn't tell if the figure had moved closer or if my imagination was playing tricks with the shadows. The rain masked every sound except the occasional snap of a branch under a heavy step. My heart thumped in my chest, loud enough I thought the figure might hear it. I kept the window covered in part, just peeking. Then, a sharp sound, a loud crack from the side of the cabin, made me spin. One of the logs I had stacked outside had rolled into the mud, but the thought of someone testing the door, seeing if it would give, made me shiver. I checked the door, making sure the latch and padlock held. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I returned to the stove, trying to calm my mind, telling myself the rain had played tricks on the shadows, that maybe a raccoon or a deer had come too close. I made myself a small dinner, beans and a slice of bread, and sat near the stove, eating slowly. The rain intensified, hammering the roof, rattling the thin panes of glass in the windows. The smell of wet earth and pine became stronger, mingling with the faint smoke of the fire. I listened, trying to ignore the creeping tension in my chest. Hours passed. I didn't hear anything besides the rain and the occasional gust of wind through the trees. Exhaustion finally caught up with me, and I lay down on the cot with a blanket pulled over me. I slept lightly, waking at intervals to check the door and windows. At some point in the night, the rain slowed to a soft drizzle, then stopped. I woke one final time to the faint light of dawn creeping through the windows, wet leaves scattered around the cabin, and everything eerily silent. In the morning, I stepped outside. The clearing was soaked, mud and puddles everywhere. The logs I had stacked outside were disturbed, one knocked over near the tree line. Deep footprints pressed into the softened ground. They were too large and deep to be mine, and the spacing suggested a person or something tall had walked in the rain around my cabin. My stomach sank. Whoever had come during the storm hadn't stayed. They had simply walked around, testing, observing, then left. There were no signs of theft, nothing missing, just those deep impressions in the mud. I stayed alert for the next few days, moving quietly, keeping the fire ready, the rifle nearby. I reinforced the door with extra boards and added a simple wooden barricade over the windows. Slowly, life returned to routine. The incident never repeated, but the memory of that night, the darkness, the rain, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me for years. I finished the cabin interior, painted the walls a muted green, added a small loft for storage, and stocked enough supplies to live out the winter if needed. Over time, I grew more comfortable. I built a small vegetable garden, trapped rabbits for food, and even installed a rainwater collection system. I learned to live with the constant possibility that someone or something might appear, And eventually, the fear turned into respect for the isolation, for the vulnerability that came with living alone in the woods. That night in the rain reminded me that the world was larger than my small cabin, larger than the boundaries I thought I controlled. Years later, I still tell the story quietly to friends, never exaggerating, never adding fantasy elements. It wasn't ghosts, it wasn't fairy tale monsters. It was just one night, in one place, in one storm, where the isolation, the darkness, and the relentless rain made even the ordinary terrifying. And yet, it didn't break me. I survived, learned, and in the end, the cabin became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary, built by my own hands, tested by fear, and proven by patience and care. The forest stayed quiet most of the time, but the memory of that rainy night, the shadows moving just beyond the clearing, remained a lesson. Fear is real, but survival is stronger. It was late October 2018 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of the city. I had been working non-stop for months, and the walls of my apartment seemed to shrink every day. I needed to get out, breathe some real air, and reset my mind. So I packed my old Subaru with camping gear, food, and a few supplies, and I brought Max along, my German Shepherd. He was 9 years old by then, still full of energy but calmer than he had been in his youth. I had found a small cabin for rent through a local listing. It was in northern Idaho, not far from Coeur d'Alene, tucked into a dense forest near a slow-moving river. The photos showed a single wooden cabin with a steep roof, a stone chimney, and a small porch overlooking a clearing. The forest around it looked thick, dark, and quiet, the perfect place to disappear for a few days. The drive from the city took most of the day. I remember the roads growing narrower, twisting, flanked by tall pines whose tops disappeared into a low-hanging fog. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, and the air had a sharp, earthy chill that smelled of wet leaves and soil. Max sat up in the passenger seat, his ears twitching with every sound. A rustle here, a distant caw of a crow there. I parked, grabbed the duffel bags, and unlocked the cabin door. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and a faint hint of smoke from the stone fireplace. Dust hung in the air, making the light from the single window seem hazy. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked in, and Max immediately trotted around, sniffing every corner. The cabin had a small living area with a table, a kitchenette with a tiny fridge, and a narrow loft above with a bed. The walls were bare except for a faded landscape painting that hung slightly crooked above the fireplace. I unpacked my things, stacked some firewood near the hearth, and fed Max. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. There was a faint hum of wind through the trees, but no other sounds. No cars, no people, just the occasional snap of a branch. Max slept at the foot of the bed, occasionally twitching in his dreams. I remember lying awake for hours, listening to the forest, feeling a mix of peace and unease. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a trail that led down to the river. The water was slow and murky, leaves floating on its surface, and the trees on the banks were thick enough that I could barely see across. I noticed signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, chewed branches, even a small den near the waterline. Max was alert, growling low at things I couldn't see, his fur rising along his back. I kept calling him to stay close, though he never strayed far. As the sun set, I returned to the cabin. The shadows in the forest grew long, and the air turned colder. I built a fire in the fireplace, its orange glow pushing back the dark. Max lay near the door, ears perked, watching the trees. Around 9 p.m., I heard the first sound that made my stomach twist. A low, dragging noise outside, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush. I froze, staring at the window. Max stiffened beside me, a deep growl rumbling from his throat. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was deliberate, careful, slow. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I grabbed a heavy flashlight and peered out, but the darkness was thick, hiding everything. Max growled again, low and warning. I threw another log on the fire, trying to push back the fear. Hours passed. I kept checking the windows, the dragging noise fading at times, then returning in bursts. Max refused to leave the door, growling and whining at intervals. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I finally drifted, it was to the sounds of twigs snapping and leaves crunching outside. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the area. The ground around the cabin was littered with broken branches, footprints, not mine or Max's, leading around the perimeter. They weren't deer tracks. They were too large, too deliberate, like someone had been pacing, watching the cabin. My stomach sank. I had read stories of people living alone in the forest, encountering hunters, squatters, or worse. I spent the next day preparing. I reinforced the windows with sticks and firewood, stacked rocks in front of the door, and made sure Max's leash was long enough to let him roam but still under control. I didn't go far from the cabin that day. The forest felt heavier, oppressive even, as if it knew I was aware of it in a different way now. Night fell again, and the dragging sounds returned. This time, louder, closer. Max barked and growled, pacing along the door. I grabbed an old hunting knife from the kitchen drawer, not because I wanted to use it, but because it gave me a small measure of comfort. The shadows outside seemed to stretch longer, the trees moving with a life of their own. The dragging stopped abruptly at midnight. Silence. Then, suddenly, a sharp, loud snap. Something heavy had hit the side of the cabin. Max leaped forward, barking ferociously, teeth bared. My heart was in my throat. I didn't sleep again. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, keeping Max close. The forest seemed to hold its breath around us. On the way back to the car, I noticed more tracks leading into the woods, heading toward the cabin. Whoever had been circling us was still out there, but they hadn't tried to follow us down the trail. I didn't look back until I reached the main road. Only then did I let myself exhale, and Max relaxed, ears drooping as we drove away. I called the cabin owner as soon as I had a cell signal and explained that we wouldn't be staying. They didn't seem surprised. Apparently, people sometimes left without explanation. That night, back in my apartment, Max curled up beside me. I made a mental note never to underestimate how isolated a place could be, how careful you had to be when you were alone, even with a dog by your side. The cabin had been beautiful, the forest serene, but there was something in the way the darkness moved, the way someone or something could watch without ever being seen, that left a permanent unease in me. Months later, I found out that the area had a few cases of trespassers and illegal hunting camps. It wasn't anything supernatural, just humans doing dangerous things. Knowing that made it worse, somehow. The fear wasn't gone, but at least it had a face I could recognize. I learned to respect the silence of the forest and the instincts of my dog. Max never liked returning to that part of Idaho, and neither did I. But I was grateful for his vigilance, for my instincts, and for getting out alive. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I can see those trees, the way the shadows pressed against the cabin walls, the low rumble of Max's growl in the dark. The fear wasn't made up. It was real, and I survived it,